ਜਹੀ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਜੇ ਤੁਝ ਲਿਆ ਸੀ ਪੱਲੇ ਅੱਡ ਕੇ ਬੇਬੀ ਦੇ ਮੋਰੇ ਹੜ ਕੱਟ ਕੇ ਸੁਣਿਆ ਏ ਲੈਂਸਰੋਂ ਨੇ ਲੈ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਵਾਲੀ ਰੋਟੀ ਜਹੀ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਰੱਬਾ ਐਡਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਫਾਸਲਾ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਡੈਡੀ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਕੈਸ਼ ਉੱਤੇ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਵੇ ਐਸ਼ ਸਾਡਾ ਬਾਪੂ ਜ਼ਿਮੀਦਾਰ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਦੇਵੇ ਕਾਰ ਉਹ ਡੈਡੀ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਕੈਸ਼ ਉੱਤੇ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਵੇ ਐਸ਼ ਸਾਡਾ ਬਾਪੂ ਜ਼ਿਮੀਦਾਰ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਦੇਵੇ ਕਾਰ ਉਹ ਡੈਡੀ ਜੀ ਦੇ ਕੈਸ਼ ਉੱਤੇ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਵੇ ਐਸ਼ ਸਾਡਾ ਬਾਪੂ ਜ਼ਿਮੀਦਾਰ ਕਿੱਥੋਂ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਦੇਵੇ ਕਾਰ
Stay in the post. Stay in the post. Stay in the post. Stay.
ਮੈਂ ਤਾਂ ਜੇ ਤੁਝ ਲਿਆ ਸੀ ਪੱਲੇ ਅੱਡ ਕੇ ਬੇਬੀ ਦੇ ਮੋਰੇ ਹੜ ਕੱਟ ਕੇ ਸੁਣਿਆ ਏ ਲੈਂਸਰੋਂ ਨੇ ਲੈ ਲਈ ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਵਾਲੀ ਰੋਟੀ ਜਹੀ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ
Okay, remember, everyone follow Ishani. Follow Ishani. Follow Ishani. Follow Ishani.
This first formation shows the long-run aggregate supply part of the aggregate supply versus aggregate demand graph. The long-run aggregate supply represents the relationship between the price level and output in the long run. The long-run aggregate supply does not change unless there is some sort of technological advancement that allows for greater productivity, hence explaining why it is a straight vertical line. The long-run aggregate supply lies at the full employment line. The x-axis represents real GDP and the y-axis represents price level.
Out, out.
This second formation shows the Keynesian curve. Keynesian economics was developed by the British economist John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. According to the Keynes theory, wages and prices are not flexible, and savings is not equal to investment. In a recession, according to the Keynes theory, the government should interfere by cutting taxes or increasing government spending, which causes a deficit. Then the government sells bonds to fund the deficit, which raises the interest rates. This in turn makes it difficult for businesses and consumers to borrow money and buy goods, causing GDP to decrease, which is called the crowding out effect, which is caused by the Keynes theory. This x-axis represents real GDP and the y-axis represents price level.
Curve. Nobody, then Ishani, come here.
This formation shows the Phillips curve and the investment demand graph. Our third graph, the Phillips curve, is used to show the relationship between unemployment and inflation, which shows an inverse relationship, meaning as inflation increases, unemployment decreases, and when inflation decreases, unemployment increases, and vice versa. The explanation for this trend is that when labor demand increases, unemployment will decrease, and companies will subsequently increase wages in order to compete and attract better workers. The increased wages in turn causes inflation to increase. The x-axis represents unemployment and the y-axis represents inflation. Our fourth graph is the investment demand graph. Investment demand refers to the demand by businesses for physical capital goods and services used to maintain or expand its operations. The x-axis is investment demand and the y-axis is real interest rates. Interest rates affect investment demand because businesses borrow money to invest, so when interest rates are higher, investment demand is lower, and vice versa, which explains why it is an inverse relationship. This formation shows the supply and demand graph, aggregate supply curve, and aggregate demand curve. For our fifth graph, the supply and demand graph, the x-axis is quantity and the y-axis is price. Demand refers to how much of a product or service is demanded by buyers. Supply refers to how much of a product or service is available to the market. Supply is upward sloping and demand is downward sloping, and their intersection represents the equilibrium in which the resources are being most efficiently used because the amount of goods supplied is equal to the amount of goods demanded. For the sixth graph, the aggregate supply curve, the x-axis is real GDP and the y-axis is price level. Some aggregate supply shifters are changes in resource prices, supply shocks, inflationary expectations, change in actions of the government, or change in productivity or technology. For the seventh graph, the aggregate demand graph, the x-axis is real GDP and the y-axis is price level. The difference between the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph and the supply and demand graph is that the aggregate supply versus aggregate demand represents the supply and demand for all the goods in the market, not just one good. If the quantity that is produced is above the full employment quantity, there would be an inflationary gap, and if the quantity is below, then there would be a recessionary gap.
Curve again.
For our eighth graph, the production possibilities curve shows the relationship between the production of two goods that use similar resources. The curve shows the maximum usage of these resources, assuming that all resources are used efficiently. Any point inside the curve shows that resources aren't being used efficiently, and any point outside the curve is not possible because there are not enough resources for it. The x-axis represents a certain good, and the y-axis represents some other good.
Now,
For our ninth graph, the orientation for this formation is a bit different. The vertical line is supposed to be the x-axis for this one, and the horizontal line is supposed to be the y-axis. The new x-axis represents the tax rate, and the new y-axis represents the tax revenue. The Laffer curve shows that as tax increases, tax revenue collected by the government also increases. However, it also shows that after a certain point, if tax rates are increased, people will not work as productively or won't work at all, so tax revenue will decrease.
okay, last one.
For our 10th graph, we have the aggregate expenditure model. Aggregate expenditure is a measure of national income. It follows the equation aggregate expenditure equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. The aggregate expenditure determines the total amount that firms and households plan to spend on goods and services at each level of income. There is also a 45-degree line which represents the consumer demand, and the intersection shows the equilibrium of when the total demand equals the total supply.